As we struggle to survive COVID and watch the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is easy, as Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros points out, to feel as though our world is like a bus packed with passengers hurtling along a mountain road with several people fighting for the driver's seat and no one really in control. Dr. Lopez-Claros goes on to say, across economic, social, and environmental domains, there are increasing predictions of severe crises ahead, some of them possibly taking the world into uncharted territory with possibly irreversible effects. The resulting fear and frustration are driving the rise of populist movements and the rejection of multilateralism, a turning inward when the need is actually to reach out to one another and collaborate in finding solutions to our problems. The question is, how can we find a coming together? The United Nations is not up to the challenge. In his book, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century, Dr. Lopez-Claros details a vast array of strategies to address the issues of our times. These are not easy solutions. They will require a coordinated focus on universal human prosperity. I invited Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros to join me for a conversation that matters about the steps needed to have a serious debate about global order that will ensure sustainability, international peace, and security. Dr. Lopez-Claros, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Stuart.
We are in uncertain times right now, and your book highlights the need for a greater coming together rather than a greater fracturing. How do we go from where we are today to where we need to be?
I think that one of the things we need to do is we need to recognize that the current institutional framework that we have in place, the global order, if you wish, that came out of World War II and the UN Charter, is no longer working. I think that one of the problems is that it has not been updated, it has not been modernized. The world is vastly different today than it was in 1945, when the UN Charter was adopted at the San Francisco Conference by 51 nations. And therefore, we are finding ourselves confronting a whole range of global problems, from climate change to widening income disparities to a renewed arms race. You mentioned the conflict in between Russia and the Ukraine, which is sending shockwaves throughout the world, including the global economy. And yet the machinery that we have to deal with these problems is highly inadequate. You have seen how, for instance, the existence of the veto in the UN Security Council essentially renders the organization powerless to do anything with respect to the current war. Look at climate change. We adopted the Paris Agreement targets in 2015, and yet emissions have continued to rise. Why? Because the targets agreed are voluntary, because there are no penalties for those who don't fulfill those targets, and we don't have an adequate institutional mechanism to allow us to confront climate change in a meaningful, binding way. And so it seems to me that unless we rethink our current global order, unless we renew many of the sound principles of the UN Charter and provide the instrumentality and the institutions, to allow us to confront these problems, we will continue to be mired in crisis, and we will be moving into increasingly dangerous territory.
How do we go about doing that, given the fact that we have leaders who do not seem to have a frame of mind that says, yeah, we want to work together collaboratively?
When in the San Francisco Conference in 1945, the members that were adopting the UN Charter were confronted with the veto as essentially a fait accompli. This organization would give this unusual power to the Soviet Union, the United States, the British Commonwealth, that it was then known, France and China, there was an uproar. There was a great deal of dissatisfaction. The heads of state and the assembled representatives of many of the other countries objected violently to the introduction of this power, because they thought that it was undemocratic and it went against the sort of the founding principles of the United Nations, which was, to create an organization that collaborate in the search for solutions to global problems. And so what they did is they introduced an article in the UN Charter, which is Article 109, which actually creates the opportunity to call what is named a review conference. Within a decade, the United Nations would be empowered to call a conference of its founding members to consider whether amendments were necessary to the UN Charter. In other words, there is already a legal way out of the current quagmire, which would be to call for a review conference and to examine the UN Charter and to see what are the changes that we need to introduce to make it fit for purpose, to modernize it and create an organization that will be a problem-solving organization rather than one that is simply reacting in an impotent way very often to some of the problems that we face. Encouragingly, the members of the European Union are already quite far ahead in having given up some elements of national sovereignty to supranational institutions. There is a European Parliament that does legislation on a Europe-wide basis. There is a European Central Bank, a European Court of Justice. There is an executive in Brussels. And at least within these 27 nations, members of the European Union, they're showing what international cooperation can mean and the benefits that it can bring about. The European Union experiment, although with some problems, has been, generally quite successful. So it seems to me that we need to think imaginatively about perhaps learning some of the lessons from Europe over the last several decades and strengthening the global institutions that we have in a way that will facilitate international cooperation.
How do we get around the fact that when you're talking about European nations, you're talking about democracies? And if you want to have a truly global impact, how do we get countries that are not democracies to buy into the idea that the world take institutions that exist, in those democracies, and then you take them to a global scale, which is, as I understand, in some part what you have suggested in your book? How do we get them to open their minds to the idea that this is in everybody's best interest?
Essentially, I think the key is to recognize that these problems that we face, I'm thinking in particular climate change, but some of the others as well. We have a serious problem of poverty, which the current crisis in which COVID-19 to begin with, but more recently the crisis the war between the Ukraine and Russia is going to worsen. We have a renewed arms race and so on. We have to recognize that democracies or not, it is in the interest of all nations to come together and to basically work cooperatively to address these issues, right? I don't have much hopes that some of the autocracies that we have in the world today are going to become democracies all of a sudden, that they will operate under the rule of law and that they will respect human rights. I think that is a long-term proposition, but climate change is not going to wait for that. The consequences of climate change are upon us, and therefore it is in the interests of countries like Russia and China and Turkey and so on, to join forces with the democracies of the West, of the European Union and North America, in an effort to address these problems in a meaningful way. Otherwise, the alternative is going to be continued crises, which are going to hit everybody, democracies or not.
Recently, I interviewed author James Falk, who just wrote a book called The Financial Cold War. And he looks into the tensions between the United States and China and worried that they may be sliding towards Thucydides' trap. And that's where you have an emerging power and an existing power coming into conflict with one another. He pointed out something that you pointed out, that they both have this same problem that exists in both jurisdictions, and that is of income inequality. Is this an issue that could be one of those touch points that you talk about, that everybody can say, okay, it is in our best interest to try and figure out how to do this across multiple jurisdictions?
It is a serious problem. Income inequality, I think, has ceased to be a purely economic problem, one of misallocation of resources, and it has become a political problem, because I think it is undermining the basis of democracy, and it is leading to a great deal of social tension. It is empowering demagogues and contributing to change the political landscape in countries in many, many, many ways, right? I'm especially concerned that unscrupulous politicians will use income inequality as a way of gaining power, because current governments are not doing enough to mitigate some of its impact, and they have not recognized the urgency of doing so. My own sense is that if we're going to pick a problem, a global challenge, that has the potential perhaps to bring nations together in a meaningful way, to work together and to strengthen our mechanisms of international cooperation, it is climate change, because it knows no boundaries, because it will affect all countries everywhere, because the scientists are increasingly alarmed that we don't have 20 or 30 years to act. It has to be done within the next decade at most. And so I think that for me, this is perhaps the most important catalyst that we may have in front of us, which gives me some hope that maybe we will get our act together. And as we feel increasingly the consequences of climate change, from sea level rise to the incidents of these extreme weather events, to the undermining of the agricultural sectors, especially in the developing world because of lack of water and other consequences, that this will catalyze the kind of action that we need to actually address climate change in a meaningful way.
So what would be the steps in being able to bring different countries, economies, regions of the world together? Because occasionally, and fairly frequently, we hear an argument from, let's say, China or India that says, yes, we're concerned, we're in this, but we also need to bring our economies and our systems up to first world standards. So in the meantime, this is how we're going to move forward. We're going to keep our status quo. How do we help them to engage differently?
Unfortunately, we don't have the resources and we don't have the time for every Chinese family to have 2 cars in their driveway and to achieve the levels of consumption that have already been achieved in the Western democracies over the last many decades. I think that we need to recognize that this problem is upon us. It is a climate emergency that we're going through, and therefore we need to rethink our institutional framework for addressing the climate change. At the moment, what we have in place is not working, that's for sure. This idea of establishing national targets which are non-binding, without penalties, that essentially we can opt out of these targets in the middle of an economic crisis and so on. That particular approach is not working. We know what the tools are that are going to help us to mitigate climate change. We know, for instance, that carbon taxes is one of the most powerful and effective tools to change incentives so that we consume less fossil fuels and that we create incentives for renewable energy and so on. At the moment, unfortunately, our politicians have not caught up with this, and they have not shown the leadership and the political will to do some things that are going to be painful. We need to find the resources to finance the transition to a renewable energy economy. This is going to take a rethinking of our priorities. Maybe we're spending too much money subsidizing energy instead of, providing support to vulnerable groups in the population who are going to be affected by rising energy. And maybe we're spending too much on weapons and defense. I'm thinking in the middle of 2020, at the worst of the COVID crisis. Let me ask you a question. How useful were nuclear weapons for countries like Russia and the United States and China? Not very. Maybe we need to rethink entirely our notions of security. Our notions of security have been very much focused on the military, on having the capacity to defend our national borders and to build up sophisticated modern systems of weapons. Maybe security has to be defined in a different sort of way that is more framed in human welfare terms. Maybe security should mean having the health infrastructure that will allow us to deal with the next pandemic in a way that doesn't put our system at risk and doesn't put the lives of people at risk. Maybe security should be framed in terms of empowering women, in terms of having resources to educate our young people so they have the skills and the knowledge which is going to allow them to operate in an increasingly complex global economy. In other words, we need, coming out of COVID-19 and the crisis, I think that we need to do some soul searching and we need to rethink our spending priorities and the ways in which we have been allocating resources. And I think that security is certainly one area in which we need to do some creative rethinking.
You touched on the interconnected economic structures around the world. We live in an interconnected financial world, there's no doubt about it. Do we, as a result, then have levers that we can pull or exercise within that structure that will allow us to, exercise a certain amount of influence on other countries, not forcing them, but nudging them to move in the right direction? For example, let's say we want to change a regulation about the kinds of elements that go into an exhaust system on a car, and if those don't exist, you can't sell that car in that country. Is that regulatory rather than writing a law? Is that a kind of mechanism that we can use to come together?
That I think that we can learn from each other's experiences. A few minutes ago, you mentioned the problem of inequality, right? Income inequality. Well, guess what? There are some countries that have been fairly successful in addressing the issues of income inequality and creating sort of more equitable societies where there is a safety net in place that protects the vulnerable groups from hunger, from disease, and so on. I think that in this sense, some of the multilateral institutions, some of the agencies of the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, we have some 22 agencies attached to the United Nations that have done some good work over the last many decades, and that have accumulated a vast store of knowledge about what policies work and what policies don't, what boosts economic development and what undermines economic development. And I think that this sharing of country experiences, this sharing of information is tremendously important. I mentioned the European Union in the past a few minutes ago, and let me just highlight that the region of the world that has the lowest levels of income inequality are actually the European Union countries, because they have developed a policy from which I think we can all learn, whereby when a country joins the European Union, if its income per capita is below the average of the rest of the countries, it is immediately entitled to receive transfers from the richer countries. And this has been, a wonderful way in which they have narrowed income differences. So, again, we have no lack of knowledge. We have the tools, we have the instruments, even to address as complex a problem as climate change. It is not absence of knowledge that is lacking. It is an issue more of political will. It is an issue of, leaders learning good lessons from other countries that have been more successful in addressing some of these problems, sharing those lessons, and then also leading, exhibiting the traits of leadership, which means sometimes making tough choices, but framing policies that attempt to improve the well-being and the welfare of the population, rather than think too much about the next election and how particular policies are going to affect my chances as a politician of becoming re-elected.
Well, your book is very detailed and goes into many, many aspects that need to be considered and then brought together in a coordinated way. Number one, I want to thank you for writing it, but most importantly, for bringing it to the attention of so many of us who are saying, okay, where do we go from here? Because as you pointed out in the foreword of the book, it feels at times like we are hurtling down a mountainside road and everybody's fighting for the driver's seat. I encourage all of you who are watching and have an interest in finding a path forward together to get a copy of the book. And I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Let me conclude sharing with you a very, very seminal thought of a very important American public personality, Granville Clark. Granville Clark was a man that went to law school with Franklin Roosevelt. They were classmates. And in the 1950s, he wrote a book called World Peace Through World Law, which at least among foreign policy experts, is a classic. And in this book, he made one very important point, which I think is the way in which I would like to conclude this interview. He said that at the national level, already for a long time, we recognize the importance of institutions, like a legislature, a judicial system, an executive, a police force, a central bank to regulate the financial system, and so on. And to the extent that these institutions work, we have development, we have prosperity. When they don't, then what we see, many of the shortcomings of especially low-income countries and poor countries in the rest of the world, where very often that poverty can be linked to institutions that don't work appropriately. What Clark said is that in this new age of interdependence and globalization, what we need to do is the next logical step. We need to create institutions at the global level to help us deal with global challenges, in the same way that 100 or 200 years ago, we created those institutions to help us deal with those problems at the national level. That is the next logical step in our evolution. And I think that many of the problems that we face are because we haven't yet recognized the importance of that insight.
Well, I hope that we do recognize the importance of that insight and move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. It was a pleasure.